in this administration of giving money to theocratic lunatics who want to murder us. $100 billion to the Ayatollah Khamenei is the single most catastrophic foreign policy decision of this administration. And today, this administration continues to refuse to enforce the oil sanctions, enriching the Ayatollah, funding Hamas, funding Hezbollah, funding those who are murdering Israelis and trying to murder Americans. How does it make sense to give billions and billions of dollars to theocratic lunatics who want to kill us?
Someone just got cornered inside a Senate hearing room, and they had no clean answer. The question was simple. The silence said everything. Watch carefully.
Ms. Gavito, you served for 2 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iran, Iraq, and Public Diplomacy. Then you became the Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs. What was your role in issuing the waivers giving Iran access to that pot of money?
Thank you very much, Senator. With regard to the $6 billion in question, the
$10 billion, not the
sorry.
not the $6 billion in ransom. That's another problematic decision.
Apologies. With regard to the electricity waivers, I, as Deputy Assistant Secretary, did not have a direct role in that particular decision. That being said, certainly was part of those discussions. As Ambassador Jacobson has noted, the intent behind those waivers was to incentivize the Iraqi government.
I'm not asking about the intent. Did you support those waivers?
I was not in a decision-making capacity.
Did you agree with the decision?
I would have to review, Senator. Yes, I believe that incentivizing Iraq to divest itself of Iranian oil is positive.
Okay, Ambassador Jacobson, these waivers will have to be renewed this summer or they expire. If confirmed, would you support reissuing those waivers?
So I'd note that those waivers have spanned at least 2 administrations and been renewed 21 times since 2018, if I'm not mistaken. I take heart from the commitment of the government of Iraq to achieve energy independence by 2030.
That's not an answer to the question. Would you support reissuing those waivers?
Well, I don't think it would be up to me, and I would be more than...
What you just heard wasn't a political speech, it was an accounting. $100 billion. Oil sanctions that exist on paper but get ignored in practice. Iran's oil exports climbing from 2,000 barrels a day to 2 million. That math doesn't lie. What's buried in this exchange is the gap between what an administration says it's doing and what the numbers actually show. The waivers, the restricted accounts, the fungibility argument that keeps getting waved away. None of this is conspiracy, it's policy on the record. Drop one word in the comments. Waivers or sanctions? Which one do you think did more damage?
Interested in serving as part of the conversation.
There is a consistent pattern in this administration of giving money to theocratic lunatics who want to murder us. $100 billion to the Ayatollah Khamenei is the single most catastrophic foreign policy decision of this administration. And today, this administration continues to refuse to enforce the oil sanctions, enriching the Ayatollah, funding Hamas, funding Hezbollah, funding those who are murdering Israelis and trying to murder Americans. How does it make sense to give billions and billions of dollars to theocratic lunatics who want to kill us?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I personally am very clear-eyed about the Iranian threat. I think I shared with you, and I'll share with others, that I have been myself on the receiving end of Iranian death threat information, including during my time in Ashgabat when President Niyazov used to remind me that the Iranians had a missile pointed at my bedroom. With regards to the funds that are kept in restricted accounts that are overseen by the Treasury Department, that are the subject of an extensive system of safeguards, these funds will never reach the government of Iran. These funds have to stay overseas, and they have to be used for humanitarian purposes. You could ask, doesn't that mean that it frees up money for their massive terrorism campaigns, which of course are heinous? And I would argue that Iran, unfortunately, is always going to focus on destabilizing activity over supporting the humanitarian needs of its own people. With regards to the sanctions, the administration hasn't lifted any sanctions, and as far as I know, it's implemented another 700 sanctions.
But
on
it refuses to enforce it. My time's expired, but the results are indisputable. And Iran has gone from selling 300,000 barrels a day of oil to selling 2 million barrels of oil a day. That is funding this war of terror against us.
2 million barrels a day. That is not a rounding error. That is not a policy footnote. That is the entire argument, sitting right there in the final 30 seconds of this exchange, and almost nobody in mainstream coverage touched it. Here is what actually happened in that room. A senator didn't come to grandstand. He came with a number. Iran was selling somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 barrels of oil per day when sanctions were being enforced. By the time this exchange took place, that figure had climbed to 2 million barrels per day. That is a tenfold increase. And the sanctions never changed. They were never lifted. They were simply not enforced. That distinction matters more than almost anything else said in that hearing room. Because here is the thing about a law that exists but isn't enforced. It isn't really a law anymore. It's a performance. It gives the administration the ability to say, as Ambassador Jacobson did, that no sanctions were lifted, that 700 new sanctions were added, that the funds are restricted, that the safeguards are extensive. All of that can be technically true, and 2 million barrels a day can also be true at the same time. That is the trap this exchange exposed. Not a lie. A gap. A deliberate, maintained, policy-level gap between what the law says and what enforcement actually looks like on the ground. But here is what nobody is asking. If the intent behind the waivers was to incentivize Iraq to wean itself off Iranian oil, and that is the stated justification, then why is Iran selling 10 times more oil than before? At what point does the justification stop being a reason and start being a cover? Who exactly benefits from the enforcement gap staying exactly where it is? Think about what this means if you are sitting on the other side of this. If you are Hamas, if you are Hezbollah, if you are an IRGC commander running a proxy network across the region, you are not reading the Federal Register. You are not tracking waiver language. You are watching oil revenue flow in. You are watching the money arrive. The mechanism doesn't matter to you. The result does. Supporters of this policy framework will argue, and they have a point worth taking seriously, that collapsing the Iraqi energy sector by cutting off Iranian electricity overnight would destabilize Baghdad in ways that create far worse security outcomes for the United States. That is a real argument. The region is not a chessboard where you can remove one piece cleanly. Pulling waivers without an alternative energy architecture in place for Iraq could push Baghdad closer to Tehran, not further. That consequence is also real. Critics will counter, and this is also a serious point, that the fungibility argument was never properly answered in that room. Jacobson tried. She said the funds are held in restricted accounts, overseen by Treasury, can only be used for humanitarian purposes. But the core challenge to that framework is simple. Money is fungible. If Iran's humanitarian import bill is being covered by restricted foreign funds, that frees up domestic revenue for everything else. You do not need to route sanctioned money directly to a missile program for it to fund one. You just need to cover the grocery bill with one hand so the other hand stays free. What both camps are missing is the structural question underneath all of this. The United States has built a sanctions architecture that has become so layered with exceptions, waivers, and carve-outs that enforcement has effectively become optional. And optional enforcement in a geopolitical context isn't neutral. It makes a choice. It picks a side. Every barrel of Iranian oil that moves without consequence is a decision, even if no one in Washington signs a document that day saying so. There are historical parallels worth sitting with here. In the 1970s, the United States maintained a complicated relationship with states that were actively funding networks hostile to American interests. The argument then, as now, was that engagement and incentive structures produce better long-term outcomes than isolation. Sometimes that argument proved right. Sometimes the money just funded the next crisis, and the generation that followed paid the price. If this is the kind of analysis you are not finding anywhere else, you already know what to do. Why now? That is the question that keeps pulling at this. These waivers were set to expire. The renewal was coming. This hearing was not abstract. It was a live policy decision being debated in real time, with the nominees who would be responsible for that renewal sitting in the witness chairs. That is not a coincidence. That is a hearing that actually mattered, which is rarer than it should be. The nominee's answer to whether she would support reissuing those waivers was not a yes. It was not a no. It was a non-answer dressed up in the language of process. I would be more than interested in serving as part of the conversation. In a functioning confirmation process, that answer would have cost her the vote. Whether it did or not is a separate question. But the answer is on the record now. The number is on the record. 2 million barrels a day is on the record. And here is the consequence that does not get resolved when this hearing ends. Iran's oil revenue doesn't pause while Washington debates waiver policy. The money moves on a schedule that has nothing to do with committee calendars. Every day the enforcement gap stays open is another day the math keeps compounding. The senators can hold all the hearings they want. The barrels don't wait for the gavel. This story is not finished. It was not finished when the senators' time expired. It is not finished now. If you made it this far, you already see what most people scrolling past the headlines will never stop to read. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to see the numbers, and drop your take in the comments, because this conversation is exactly the one that needs to keep going.